He thought he was walking into a quiet diner, but that night, the law was already sitting at the table. The neon sign outside flickered softly against the dark Texas sky, casting a pale glow over the empty parking lot as a warm hum of conversation and clinking silverware filled the small roadside diner just off Highway 81, where truckers, late-shift workers, and tired families gathered under yellow lights that made everything feel a little safer than the world outside. And inside, at a booth near the window, two men sat across from each other, calm, composed, almost invisible in the rhythm of the room. Marcus Reed leaned back slightly in his seat, a half-finished cup of coffee resting in his hand, his posture relaxed but his eyes quietly observant, while across from him, Ethan Cole stirred his drink with slow, deliberate movements, scanning the reflections in the glass without ever turning his head, the kind of awareness that didn't belong to ordinary customers. And for a moment, everything felt ordinary. The waitress smiled as she passed by, the low murmur of a country song drifted from an old jukebox in the corner, and no one paid them any special attention, at least not yet, because across the room, near the counter, a man in uniform had just stepped through the door. Officer Daniel Brooks paused for a second as the bell above the entrance chimed, his eyes adjusting quickly as they swept across the diner, not casually, not politely, but with the sharp, measuring look of someone who believed the room belonged to him the second he entered it. His boots hit the tile floor, with slow, heavy steps, each one deliberate, each one announcing authority without a word. And as he moved deeper into the diner, conversations began to lower, not because anyone was told to be quiet, but because something in the air shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm you can't yet see. Brooks didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't acknowledge the regulars who had seen him a dozen times before. Instead, his gaze locked onto one table, one booth, one pair of men who, in his mind, didn't fit. Marcus and Ethan didn't look up right away. They didn't need to. They had already noticed him the second he walked in. The reflection in the window had given it away. The change in energy had confirmed it. And still, they remained calm. Marcus took a slow sip of his coffee, setting the cup down gently, while Ethan placed his spoon beside his glass with quiet precision, as if both men had silently agreed to let the moment unfold. Brooks approached their table without hesitation, stopping just close enough to invade their space, his shadow stretching across the surface of the booth, his presence loud even before he spoke. And when he did, his voice cut through the room like a blade, sharp, controlled, and laced with something heavier than authority, something colder, something personal. "You too," he said, his tone flat but firm. "This isn't your place. I'm going to need you to finish up and head out now." The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been, and for a second, no one moved, no one spoke, not the waitress standing by the counter, not the couple in the corner pretending not to listen, not even Marcus or Ethan, who simply sat there, still as stone, their silence louder than any argument could have been. Imagine sitting there, in a place where you've done nothing wrong, where you're just another customer under warm lights and familiar sounds, and suddenly being told you don't belong. Not because of what you did, but because of what someone decided they saw. Marcus finally looked up, his expression calm, unreadable, his voice steady when he spoke. "We're just having dinner, officer." No challenge, no defiance, just a simple truth. But Brooks didn't respond to the words, because he wasn't there for answers. He was there for control. His jaw tightened slightly, his hand resting near his belt, as if the gesture alone reinforced his authority. "I said it's time to go," he repeated, louder now, making sure the entire diner could hear, making sure the moment became public, visible, undeniable. And around them, the room fell into a deeper silence, the kind where people stop eating, stop talking, stop pretending, because something uncomfortable was unfolding right in front of them, something that didn't feel right, but no one dared interrupt. Ethan slowly leaned back in his seat, his eyes finally meeting Brooks for the first time, calm, steady, almost curious, and for just a fraction of a second, something flickered in the air between them, something Brooks didn't recognize, couldn't place, a quiet confidence that didn't match the situation, a stillness that didn't belong to someone being pushed out. But he ignored it, because in his mind, this was already decided, this was already over. He just didn't know yet. it hadn't even begun. The silence did not break all at once. It settled deeper, heavier, like the air itself had decided to hold its breath. And in that stillness, every small sound became louder. The hum of the refrigerator behind the counter, the faint scrape of a fork against a plate, the slow ticking of a wall clock that no one had noticed before. And yet at that table, none of it mattered, because all attention had narrowed into a single moment, a single decision. Marcus did not move right away. He did not raise his voice or shift in his seat. Instead, he let the weight of the officer's words sit there, as if measuring them, as if giving them one last chance to make sense. But they did not. And when he finally spoke again, his tone remained calm, steady, almost quiet enough that Brooks had to lean in slightly to catch it. We paid for our meal. We are not causing any trouble. There was no edge in his voice, no challenge, just a statement, simple and grounded, the kind of truth that should have ended the conversation. But it did not, because this was never about the meal. Brooks exhaled sharply through his nose, a small sound that carried more frustration than it should have, his eyes narrowing as if the calm response irritated him more than defiance ever could, because defiance he understood, defiance he could react to. But this stillness, this refusal to escalate, it unsettled something in him he did not want to acknowledge. You do not get to decide that, he replied, his voice louder now, sharper, drawing more eyes from across the diner. I am telling you it is time to leave. The words echoed slightly against the tiled floor and glass windows, and around them, people shifted in their seats, not enough to intervene, but enough to signal discomfort. A waitress froze mid-step near the coffee machine, her eyes darting between the officer and the two men, unsure whether to approach or stay back, unsure what role she was allowed to play in a moment that suddenly felt far bigger than a simple request. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, his movements slow, controlled, deliberate, and when he spoke, his voice was even quieter than Marcus's, but somehow it carried further, cutting through the tension with precision. Officer, is there a reason you are asking us to leave? It was a fair question, a reasonable question, the kind that should have been met with explanation, with clarity, but Brooks did not answer right away, because the question itself shifted the ground beneath him. It forced him into a space where justification was expected, where authority alone was no longer enough, and for a brief moment, that hesitation showed, just a flicker, just enough for someone paying attention to notice. And Marcus noticed, Ethan noticed, and even a few people in the diner noticed, though they would not have been able to explain why. Brooks straightened his posture, his hand brushing against his belt again, not gripping, just touching, a gesture more about control than action. You match a description, he said finally, the words coming out quickly, almost too quickly, as if he had decided on them in the moment. We have had reports. I am not going to repeat myself. The explanation was vague, incomplete, and it hung in the air with a hollowness that did not go unnoticed. Marcus tilted his head slightly, not in confusion, but in quiet acknowledgement, as if he had heard this kind of reasoning before, as if he recognized the pattern, and for a second, his eyes shifted toward the window, catching Ethan's reflection again, a silent exchange passing between them, something unspoken but understood. Imagine realizing that the situation unfolding in front of you is not random, not accidental, but part of something larger, something that has played out before in different places, with different faces, and yet always the same underlying assumption, the same quiet judgment, the same attempt to push, to remove, to control. Ethan sat back again, his expression unchanged, but there was something in his posture now, something firmer, something more anchored, as if a line had been quietly drawn, not visible to anyone else, but very real to him. And when he spoke, again his voice carried a different weight, still calm, still controlled, but unmistakably final. We are not leaving, he said, not loudly, not aggressively, just clearly, and that clarity shifted the entire room, because now there was no middle ground, no misunderstanding. The moment had moved from suggestion to standoff, and Brooks felt it. Even if he refused to name it, his jaw tightened again, his eyes flicking briefly toward the other customers, aware now that he was no longer just addressing two men at a table. He was being watched, evaluated, his actions unfolding in front of an audience he could not control. And that awareness only sharpened his tone further. "Do not make this harder than it needs to be," he said, each word measured, each word carrying the weight of an unspoken warning. But across from him, Marcus did something unexpected. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply reached for his coffee again, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set the cup back down with steady hands, as if nothing in the room had changed, as if the tension itself did not exist. And that was the moment, the exact moment, when something shifted in a way Brooks could not yet understand. Because calm, true calm, does not come from ignorance. It comes from certainty. And sitting across that table, Marcus and Ethan were not uncertain at all. For a brief second, it almost looked like nothing was going to happen, like the moment might dissolve into awkward silence and everyone would return to their meals. But that illusion faded the instant Officer Brooks took one step closer to the table. Not fast, not aggressive, just deliberate enough to make it clear he was not backing down, his shadow stretching further across the surface of the booth, cutting through the warm yellow light like a line being drawn that no one had agreed to cross. And yet here it was, being crossed anyway. "You are refusing a lawful order," he said, his voice lower now, tighter, as if he had decided to bring the moment back under his control by narrowing it, compressing it, turning it into something official, something procedural. But even that shift did not land the way he expected, because across from him, Marcus did not react to the words, he reacted to the tone, to the intention behind them, and his eyes lifted slowly, meeting Brooks with a calm that was no longer passive, no longer just patient. It was aware, fully aware, as if he had been waiting for this exact point, this exact line to be spoken out loud. And Ethan noticed it too. The subtle change, the almost invisible shift in posture that signaled something had moved from observation into decision. Imagine realizing that the person in front of you has already understood the situation more clearly than you have, that while you believed you were leading the moment, they were quietly letting it unfold, letting you define yourself with every word, every assumption, every step closer. And still, no one raised their voice, no one made a scene. The tension stayed contained, controlled, but it was no longer neutral. It had direction now. It was moving towards something. Brooks glanced briefly over his shoulder, catching the eyes of a few customers who quickly looked away, the kind of reaction that told him they were watching, even if they pretended not to be, and that awareness pressed against him in a way he did not like. Because authority feels different when it is observed, when it is measured, when it is not simply accepted. He turned back to the table, his expression hardening slightly, doubling down on the position he had already taken. "Last warning," he said, each word spaced out, deliberate, leaving no room for interpretation. But Marcus did not respond right away. Instead, he reached down beside him, not quickly, not secretly, just naturally, as if retrieving something he had every right to access. And that simple movement shifted Brooks' focus instantly, his eyes narrowing, his stance tightening, because in his mind, movement meant escalation, even when it did not, even when it was nothing more than a hand reaching for an object. And for a split second, the entire diner leaned into that motion without realizing it. Forks paused mid-air, conversations died completely. Even the hum of the room seemed to quiet, as if waiting to see what would come next. But Marcus did not rush. He did not rush anything. His hand came back into view holding nothing threatening, nothing dramatic, just a folded leather wallet, worn at the edges, ordinary in appearance. And yet the way he held it was anything but ordinary. There was intention in it, a quiet precision that did not match the situation Brooks thought he was controlling. Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning back again, his eyes no longer scanning the room but fixed directly on Brooks, steady, unblinking. And then Marcus spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that cut through everything else. "Before this goes any further," he said, his voice even, grounded, "you might want to take a closer look at who you are talking to." The words landed softly, but they carried weight, not as a threat, not as a challenge, but as a fact waiting to be acknowledged. And Brooks frowned slightly, just enough to show that something in the statement did not align with what he believed was happening. Because in his mind, he already knew who they were. He had already decided, already categorized, already concluded. and that certainty had guided every step he had taken since walking through the door. So the idea that there was something he had missed, something he had overlooked, it did not fit, it did not belong. And yet there it was, sitting in front of him, calm, patient, undeniable. Marcus slowly opened the wallet, not revealing anything yet, not rushing the moment, just allowing it to exist, allowing Brooks one final chance to see the situation differently, to step back before it shifted beyond his control. But Brooks did not step back. He leaned in slightly instead, his voice sharper now, edged with irritation that he could no longer hide. "I do not need to look at anything," he said, dismissing the gesture outright, dismissing the possibility that there was more to this than he had already decided. And that was the moment, quiet but irreversible, when the balance tipped. Not in volume, not in movement, but in truth, because the moment you refuse to see, you also refuse to understand. And once that happens, everything that follows is no longer a misunderstanding, it is a choice. The refusal did not explode into chaos. It settled into something far more dangerous, a quiet certainty that now filled the space between them. And for the first time since he walked in, Officer Brooks hesitated, not outwardly, not in a way anyone could easily point to, but internally, a brief flicker of doubt that passed through his mind like a shadow he refused to acknowledge. Because everything in front of him no longer aligned as cleanly as it had a moment ago. The man across from him was not defensive, not nervous, not even irritated in the way most people would be under pressure. Marcus Reed was composed, grounded, and more importantly, patient, the kind of patience that does not come from submission, but from knowing exactly where a situation is going. And that realization, small as it was, began to press against Brooks' confidence in ways he could not fully explain. Still, he pushed forward, because stepping back now would mean questioning himself, and that was something he was not prepared to do. "I gave you a clear order," he said again, his tone sharper, louder, trying to reclaim the authority that felt like it was slipping. "You do not get to negotiate with me." The words echoed through the diner, louder than before, heavier, drawing every eye in the room without exception. And this time, no one pretended not to watch. The waitress stood frozen behind the counter. A man near the door leaned slightly forward, his coffee untouched. Even the jukebox seemed to fade into the background, as if the entire space had shifted into a single point of focus. And in that moment, the diner was no longer just a place to eat. It was a stage where something deeper was unfolding, something that everyone could feel, but no one dared interrupt. Marcus slowly closed the wallet in his hand, not hiding it, not putting it away, just holding it there, as if giving Brooks one final opportunity to reconsider, one final moment to look beyond assumption and see what was right in front of him. But Brooks did not look. He refused to. His eyes stayed locked on Marcus' face, not the object in his hand, because to look would mean to question, and to question would mean to admit that he might not be in control. Ethan shifted slightly in his seat, his posture straightening, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but with a quiet firmness that signaled something had changed, something had reached its limit. And when he spoke, his voice carried a different tone now, still calm, still measured, but unmistakably final. "You are making a mistake," he said, each word clear, deliberate, leaving no room for misinterpretation, and the simplicity of that sentence landed harder than anything else that had been said so far, because it did not argue, it did not defend, it stated a fact, one that Brooks was actively choosing to ignore. Imagine standing at the edge of a moment where everything could still be corrected, where one step back could change the entire outcome, and instead choosing to move forward, not because you are right, but because you cannot accept the possibility that you are wrong. Brooks let out a short breath, something between a scoff and a laugh, though there was no humor in it, only frustration, only the tightening grip of a situation he no longer fully understood. "The only mistake here," he replied, his voice cold, controlled, "is you thinking you have a choice." And with that, he reached toward his radio, not activating it yet, just touching it, a gesture that signaled escalation without fully committing to it, a line drawn in the air that suggested what would come next if they did not comply. But even that gesture did not have the effect he expected, because Marcus did not react to it, did not flinch, did not rush. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, placing the closed wallet gently on the table between them. The movement slow, deliberate, impossible to misread. And then he did something even more unexpected. He slid it across the table toward Brooks, not forcefully, not dramatically, just enough for it to rest within the officer's reach. And in that simple act, the entire dynamic shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but undeniably, because control is not always about who speaks the loudest or stands the tallest. Sometimes it is about who understands the moment, who sees the truth before it is revealed, and who has the patience to let it unfold exactly as it needs to. The diner remained silent, every eye fixed on the small leather wallet now sitting between them, an ordinary object carrying an extraordinary weight. And for the first time since the confrontation began, Brooks looked down, just for a second, just long enough for uncertainty to enter the space he had filled with certainty. And in that second, everything changed. The moment stretched longer than it should have, a single second expanding into something heavy, something irreversible, as Officer Brooks' eyes dropped to the wallet resting on the table. And for the first time since he had entered the diner, his attention shifted away from control and toward uncertainty, not fully, not willingly, but enough, just enough to break the illusion he had been holding on to. Because now there was something in front of him he had not accounted for, something that did not fit the narrative he had already decided was true, and that discomfort, that quiet disruption, began to settle in, slow and unwelcome. Marcus did not rush him, did not speak, did not push the moment forward. He simply sat there, steady, composed, allowing Brooks the space to make his next move, because this was no longer about confrontation, it was about realization, and realization cannot be forced. It has to arrive on its own. Ethan remained silent as well, his gaze fixed on Brooks with a calm intensity that said everything without needing a single word, the kind of silence that does not demand attention, but commands it anyway. And around them, the diner held its breath, every person now fully aware that something important was unfolding, something that had moved far beyond a simple disagreement. Brooks hesitated, his hand hovering just above the wallet, not touching it yet, as if even that small action carried weight, as if opening it might reveal something he was not prepared to face. Imagine standing at the edge of a truth you did not expect, a truth that could undo everything you believed about the moment you are in, and realizing that once you see it, you cannot unsee it, that once you acknowledge it, there is no going back to what you thought you knew. His jaw tightened slightly, a flicker of resistance passing through him, because authority, once questioned, does not easily recover. And yet the pressure of the moment, the eyes in the room, the silence that had grown too loud to ignore, all of it pushed him forward, slowly, reluctantly. Brooks reached down and picked up the wallet, his movements careful, controlled, but no longer confident. And when he opened it, the shift was immediate, not dramatic, not explosive, but undeniable. His eyes scanned what was inside, once, then again, as if his mind needed a second pass to process what it was seeing. And in that instant, the entire dynamic of the room changed, not because of what was said, but because of what was understood. Marcus watched him closely, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with a quiet steadiness, as if this outcome had always been inevitable, as if the moment Brooks chose not to look earlier had already set this in motion. Ethan leaned slightly forward again, his voice calm but now carrying a weight that filled the silence. "Take your time," he said, not as a suggestion, but as a statement, and those three words landed differently now, because they were no longer about patience, they were about certainty. Brooks did not respond, not immediately, his eyes still fixed on the contents of the wallet, his expression tightening in ways he could not control, because what he was seeing did not match what he had assumed. It did not align with the narrative he had built from the moment he walked through the door, and that realization, quiet as it was, carried consequences, real ones, ones that extended beyond this diner, beyond this table, beyond this single interaction. His grip on the wallet shifted slightly, his fingers tightening just enough to reveal the tension he was trying to suppress. And for the first time, his posture changed, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to signal that something inside him had shifted. The certainty was gone, replaced by something else, something heavier, something closer to doubt. Marcus finally spoke again, his voice steady, measured, but now carrying a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. "You made a call before you had the facts," he said, each word deliberate, each word landing exactly where it needed to, not as an accusation, but as a truth, simple and undeniable, and Brooks heard it, whether he wanted to or not. Because now the evidence was in his hands. Now the reality was no longer something he could ignore. And in that moment, standing in the middle of a quiet diner with a room full of witnesses and a truth unfolding in front of him, Officer Brooks was no longer the one in control of the situation. He was the one trying to understand how he had lost it. The shift was no longer subtle. It was complete, even if no one had spoken the words out loud. Because once the truth is seen, it does not need to be announced. It reveals itself in the smallest changes, in the tightening of a jaw, in the stillness of a hand, in the silence that suddenly feels heavier than any argument, and standing there with the open wallet in his hand. Officer Brooks felt that shift in a way he could not ignore. The badge inside was not just an identification, it was a reality he had not prepared for, a reality that did not align with the assumptions he had built so quickly, so confidently. And for the first time, his authority did not feel solid. It felt fragile, like something balanced on a misunderstanding that had just been exposed. His eyes moved across the identification again, slower this time, more carefully, as if searching for a detail that might allow him to reinterpret what he was seeing. But there was none. The names were clear, the credentials unmistakable, the implication unavoidable. Marcus Reed and Ethan Cole were not just customers. They were part of something far beyond this diner, far beyond this moment. And suddenly, every word Brooks had spoken replayed in his mind, not as commands, but as evidence. Imagine realizing that the moment you thought you were controlling has been observing you the entire time, that every decision you made, every assumption you acted on, has quietly built a case you did not know you were part of. Brooks closed the wallet slowly, his movements no longer deliberate in the way they had been before, but cautious, measured, as if the space around him had changed in a way he needed to respect. His hand lowered slightly, holding the wallet but no longer in control of it, because control had shifted, not through force, not through volume, but through truth. Marcus leaned back in his seat just enough to give the moment room to settle, his eyes never leaving Brooks, not in challenge, not in judgment, but in quiet acknowledgement of what had just happened. Ethan exhaled slowly, his posture relaxed again, but there was a firmness beneath it now, something resolved, something that did not need to prove itself, because it already had. The diner remained silent, but the silence was different now. It was no longer tense with uncertainty, it was filled with understanding, with the quiet realization that something important had just been revealed, something that changed the meaning of everything that came before it. Brooks cleared his throat slightly, a small sound that felt louder than it should have, because it broke the silence, because it marked the moment where he could no longer pretend nothing had changed. But even then, the words did not come easily, because what do you say when the authority you believed you had has just been redefined in front of you? What do you say when the people you tried to remove are now the ones holding the truth of the situation? He hesitated, just for a second, and that second said everything. Marcus reached forward calmly, taking the wallet back without urgency, without force, simply reclaiming what had always been his. And as he did, he spoke, his voice steady, grounded, carrying a quiet weight that filled the room. "You walked in here already decided," he said, not accusing, not raising his tone, just stating what had become clear. "You did not ask questions, you did not observe, you assumed." Each word landed softly, but there was no escaping them, because they were not opinions, they were facts, facts that had just been confirmed in the most undeniable way. Brooks listened, whether he wanted to or not, because now there was nothing to interrupt, nothing to override. The moment belonged to something else, something beyond him, something he had unknowingly stepped into. Ethan leaned slightly forward, his eyes steady, his voice calm but firm. "And assumptions," he added, "have consequences." The sentence hung in the air, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a simple truth, one that extended beyond this diner, beyond this interaction, into something larger, something systemic, something that could not be undone by a single correction. Brooks shifted his weight slightly, his posture no longer as rigid, no longer as certain, because certainty requires control, and control was no longer his to claim. His radio crackled softly at his side, a faint burst of static that seemed almost symbolic, a reminder that the world outside this diner was still moving, still connected to what was happening here. And for the first time, that connection did not feel like an extension of his authority. It felt like something that might be watching, something that might already be aware, and in that moment, standing in a quiet diner under soft yellow lights, surrounded by witnesses and truth and a reality he could no longer deny, Officer Brooks understood something he had not understood. Before, this was never just a routine stop, and he was never the one in control of how it would end. The words did not echo loudly, but they lingered, settling into the space like something permanent, something that could not be taken back or rephrased, and for a moment, no one moved. Not Marcus, not Ethan, not even Officer Brooks, who now stood in the same place he had claimed so confidently just minutes ago. Except everything about that position had changed. The authority he carried into the diner no longer filled the room the way it had before. It no longer dictated the energy. It no longer controlled the outcome. And that shift was not dramatic. It was quiet, undeniable, and deeply unsettling. Brooks' eyes moved briefly across the diner, not in command, but in awareness. Noticing the way people were watching now, not with fear, not with indifference, but with something else, something closer to judgment, not spoken, not expressed, but present all the same. And that realization pressed against him in a way he had not expected, because authority feels different when it is questioned, but it feels entirely different when it is understood, when the illusion behind it is seen clearly. Imagine standing in a room where every action you took just moments ago is now being replayed, not in your mind alone, but in the silent awareness of everyone around you. Each word weighed differently, each decision carrying more meaning than it did when it was first made. Brooks shifted slightly, his hand moving away from his radio, not because he had decided anything, but because the need to use it no longer felt the same. The urgency had dissolved, replaced by something slower, heavier, something closer to consequence. Marcus remained seated, his posture relaxed but grounded, his presence steady in a way that did not demand attention but held it anyway. And when he spoke again, his voice was not louder, not sharper, but it carried a clarity that filled the silence without effort. This was not about policy, he said, his tone even, measured. It was about perception. The sentence landed softly, but it reached further than anything else that had been said, because it named something deeper, something that extended beyond this diner, beyond this interaction, something that could not be corrected with a simple apology or a change in tone. Brooks did not respond immediately, because there was no quick response to that kind of truth, no immediate defense that could erase what had already unfolded. His expression tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, a recognition he did not want but could not avoid. Ethan leaned forward just enough to rest his hands lightly on the table, his voice calm, steady, but now carrying a quiet authority that had been present all along, simply waiting to be acknowledged. "You saw two men," he said, each word deliberate, "and decided what that meant before you ever asked a question." Again, not an accusation, not a confrontation, but a statement, one that connected every moment that had led to this point. And as it settled into the room, the weight of it became clear, not just to Brooks, but to everyone listening, because it was not just about him. It was about something larger, something familiar, something many in that room had seen before, experienced before, understood without needing it explained. Brooks let out a slow breath, his shoulders lowering slightly, not in defeat, but in something closer to realization, the kind that does not arrive all at once, but unfolds piece by piece, forcing you to see what you had overlooked, what you had ignored, what you had assumed without question. His gaze returned to Marcus and Ethan, but it was different now, no longer narrowed, no longer fixed with certainty, but searching, trying to reconcile the version of events he had believed with the reality now standing in front of him. And that gap, that space between assumption and truth, was where everything had changed. The diner remained quiet, but it was no longer tense. It was attentive, as if everyone understood that what was happening was not just a moment. It was a lesson unfolding in real time, not loud, not dramatic, but powerful in its simplicity. Marcus leaned slightly forward, just enough to close the distance between them without breaking the calm that had defined the entire interaction, and his voice, when he spoke again, carried something new. Not just clarity, not just control, but purpose. The difference between authority and abuse, he said slowly, is whether you are willing to see people before you judge them. The words settled into the space, not demanding agreement, not forcing reaction, but leaving no room to ignore their meaning. And in that moment, standing under the soft lights of a quiet diner, surrounded by witnesses who had seen everything unfold, Officer Brooks was no longer facing two men he had tried to remove. He was facing the reality of what he had revealed about himself, and that realization, quiet as it was, carried more weight than anything he could say to change it. The diner did not erupt after those words. It did not break into noise or sudden movement. Instead, it held on to the silence. But now that silence carried a different weight, not tension, not fear, but recognition, as if something had just been named that everyone understood, but no one had said out loud until now. And in that quiet, Officer Brooks stood still, not frozen, not defeated, but paused in a way that felt unfamiliar to him, because for the first time, the situation was no longer something he could control through presence or authority. It was something he had to face, something that required him to see beyond himself, and that was not a position he had prepared for. His eyes lowered briefly, not in submission, but in thought, a moment of internal recalibration that did not come easily, because what he was confronting was not just the situation in front of him, it was the way he had moved through it, the decisions he had made without question, the assumptions that had guided him without hesitation. Imagine standing in a moment where the problem is no longer what is happening around you, but what has already happened because of you, and realizing that the only way forward is to acknowledge it, not to fix it instantly, not to erase it, but to recognize it fully. Brooks took a slow breath, deeper than any he had taken since stepping into the diner, and when he finally spoke, his voice was different, not softer in volume, but stripped of the edge it had carried. Before, I did not have all the information, he said, the words measured, careful, as if he was choosing them one by one. And while they were not an apology, they were not a defense either. They were something in between, an attempt to bridge the gap between what had been assumed and what was now understood. Marcus watched him steadily, not interrupting, not reacting immediately, because the moment was still unfolding, still shaping itself, and rushing it would only break the clarity that had finally begun to settle in. Ethan remained still as well, his gaze unwavering, not demanding anything, not pushing for more, simply present in a way that made it impossible for Brooks to retreat back into certainty, because now certainty had been replaced by awareness. And awareness does not disappear once it arrives, Brooks continued, not because he had found the perfect words, but because silence alone was no longer enough. That does not change what happened, he added, and this time, there was something more in his tone, something closer to acknowledgement, something that recognized the weight of the moment without trying to minimize it. And those words landed differently, not because they resolved anything, but because they did not attempt to escape responsibility. The diner remained quiet, but now the quiet felt grounded, as if the tension that had once filled the room had been replaced by something more honest, something more real. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his hands resting calmly on the table, his voice steady as he responded, "No, it does not," he said, not harshly, not coldly, just truthfully, allowing the statement to stand on its own without adding anything unnecessary, because sometimes clarity does not need elaboration. It only needs to be heard. Brooks nodded once, a small movement, but one that carried more meaning than any of his earlier gestures, because it was no longer about asserting control. It was about accepting what had already been revealed. His posture shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to show that something within him had settled into a new understanding, something that could not undo what had happened, but could influence what came next. Outside, faint through the glass windows, the sound of a car pulling into the parking lot could be heard, tires rolling slowly over gravel, a subtle reminder that the world was still moving, still connected to this moment in ways that were not immediately visible. Ethan's eyes flicked briefly toward the window, then back to Brooks, as if acknowledging that this was not the end of the situation. only a turning point within it. Marcus followed that glance for just a second before returning his attention to the officer, his voice calm, deliberate, carrying a quiet authority that did not need to be declared. "What matters now," he said slowly, "is what you do with what you have just learned." And that sentence settled into the room with a weight that felt both heavy and open, because it did not dictate an outcome. It presented a choice that belonged entirely to Brooks, and for the first time since he had stepped into the diner. That choice did not feel like something he could make quickly or easily. It felt like something that required reflection, something that extended beyond this table, beyond this moment, into the way he would carry himself moving forward, and standing there under the soft glow of diner lights, surrounded by witnesses who had seen everything unfold. Officer Brooks understood that this was not just about correcting a situation, it was about confronting the mindset that had created it. And that kind of confrontation does not end in a single moment. It begins there. The sound of the car outside did not interrupt the moment, but it anchored it, a quiet reminder that what had just unfolded inside that diner was no longer contained within those walls. It was part of something larger now, something that would continue beyond this table, beyond this night. And as the headlights briefly passed across the window, casting shifting shadows over the booth, Officer Brooks stood there with a stillness that no longer came from control, but from reflection, the kind that does not arrive easily, the kind that forces you to sit with what you have done rather than move past it. His eyes lifted once more to Marcus and Ethan, but this time, there was no attempt to define them, no quick judgment, no silent conclusion, only observation, careful, deliberate, as if seeing them clearly for the first time required effort he had never needed before. Imagine realizing that the moment you thought was routine was actually a test you did not know you were taking, and that every choice you made revealed more about you than it did about anyone else. Brooks nodded again, slower this time, the movement carrying a weight that had not been there before, and while the room did not shift dramatically, something subtle changed, something internal, something that did not erase the past few minutes, but acknowledged them in a way that allowed something new to take shape. Marcus leaned back slightly, his posture easing just enough to signal that the confrontation, as it had existed, was over, not resolved, not undone, but complete, and Ethan followed that shift, his gaze softening just enough to release the tension that had been held so carefully throughout the entire exchange. The diner began to breathe again, not all at once, but gradually, the quiet murmur of voices returning, the soft clink of dishes resuming, life continuing in a way that felt both normal and changed at the same time, because everyone in that room had witnessed something that would stay with them long after they left. Brooks stepped back from the table, not abruptly, not as a retreat, but as a conscious decision to create space, the kind of space that had not existed when he first approached, and for a moment, he seemed as if he might say something more, something to fill the silence, something to redefine the moment in his own words. But he did not, because some moments do not need more words, they need understanding, and understanding had already begun to take root. Marcus watched him carefully, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet steadiness that reflected the same principle he had carried from the beginning, that dignity does not need to be demanded, it only needs to be maintained. Ethan reached for his glass again, taking a slow sip, the simple action signaling a return to normalcy, but also a quiet statement that they had never left it, that they had remained grounded in who they were regardless of how they had been treated. Brooks turned slightly, his gaze moving once more across the diner, but now it was different, no longer scanning for control, no longer searching for who belonged and who did not, but observing, taking in the space as it was, not as he had assumed it to be, and that shift, small as it might have seemed, carried a significance that extended far beyond that room. Because perspective, once changed, does not easily return to what it was, and as he made his way toward the door, his steps slower, more measured than when he had entered, the bell above the entrance chimed softly once again, marking not just his exit, but the end of something and the beginning of something else, something quieter, something more difficult, something that would not be resolved in a single moment, but would follow him beyond that diner, beyond that night, into every decision he made moving forward, and back at the booth, under the warm glow of the overhead lights. Marcus and Ethan sat in calm silence for a moment longer, not needing to speak, not needing to explain, because the truth had already been revealed, not through force, not through confrontation, but through patience, through clarity, through the simple act of letting a man see what he had chosen not to see. And as the world outside continued to move, as cars passed, and lights flickered and conversations resumed,